Welcome to Blackman Folktales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. She loved me. I betrayed her. David had grown up with the kind of scars that never really faded, the invisible kind that carved themselves into a man's heart and left him bleeding long after the wound was dealt. He was a product of a broken home, raised on empty promises and nights filled with shouting voices that drowned out any semblance of peace. His father was a shadow, sometimes present, often gone, and when present, he was a storm of anger and bitterness. His mother, worn thin by disappointment, carried love like a candle in the wind, always flickering, always threatened to be extinguished by the chaos around her. By the time David reached adulthood, he had convinced himself that love was a trap, a weakness, a cruel joke that life played on people who dared to believe in fairy tales. He armored himself in arrogance, in recklessness, in the kind of hollow confidence that made people think he didn't care. But at night, when the noise of the world died down, he could hear the gnawing emptiness inside him, a silence that screamed louder than any voice ever could. He carried this emptiness like a shadow, wearing in the way he pushed people away, in the way he sabotaged anything that came close to meaning too much. His life was a series of short-lived thrills, temporary highs, and fleeting connections, because deep down, he didn't believe anyone could ever truly stay. And then, out of nowhere in the midst of his chaotic existence, she appeared, Sarah. She didn't storm into his life like some dramatic force. Instead, she entered quietly, with a smile that seemed to hold the kind of peace David had never known. At first, he dismissed her kindness as naivety, convinced that sooner or later, she would see through him, realize he wasn't worth the effort, and walk away like everyone else had. But Sarah wasn't like the others. She didn't just see him, she understood him. Where others saw his flaws, she saw a man fighting battles no one else could see. Where others gave up, she chose to stay. And for the first time in his life, David began to feel the terrifying weight of what it meant to be truly seen, truly loved. Sarah's love wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady, patient, and unwavering, the kind of love that held a mirror up to David and forced him to confront the truth he had been running from all his life. She became his anchor, grounding him when his mind threatened to spiral into old patterns of self-destruction. When he lashed out in fear, she didn't retaliate. She reached out. When he pulled away, convinced that abandonment was inevitable, she followed, not with desperation, but with quiet persistence, reminding him that she wasn't going anywhere. Sarah didn't just love him in words. She proved it in actions. She sacrificed opportunities, turning down a lucrative job in another city just to remain close to him when he needed her most. She distanced herself from friends who mocked her for staying by his side, insisting he was a lost cause, that she was wasting her youth on a man who would only break her. But Sarah didn't measure her decisions by the opinions of others. She measured them by the pulse of her own heart, and her heart told her David was worth it. She was the kind of woman who prayed for him when he couldn't pray for himself, who saw the man he could become rather than the man he was. And slowly, painfully, David began to believe it too. For the first time, he started to envision a future that wasn't defined by his past. He began to imagine himself building something lasting, something beautiful, something he had never dared to dream of before, a life with her. He would lie awake at night watching her sleep, her face serene, her breathing soft, and he would wonder what he had done to deserve her. But that thought also haunted him, because in the deepest part of his soul, David didn't believe he truly deserved Sarah. Her love felt like a gift he had stolen, something fragile that he was destined to break. And though he swore to himself that he would protect her, that he would never let her regret choosing him, there was an unease beneath the surface, a whisper of insecurity that warned him, love this pure cannot last forever. And yet, in those early days, everything felt almost perfect, so perfect that David often wondered was all just a dream he would one day wake up from. He walked through life with Sarah by his side, and for the first time felt like he wasn't just surviving, but living. She gave his days meaning, his nights warmth, and his future hope. But perfection has a way of breeding fear in those who have never known it. The closer Sarah drew to his heart, the louder the whispers of doubt became. What if he failed her? What if one day she woke up and realized he wasn't enough? What if love, like everything else in his life, eventually crumbled into dust? David carried these thoughts like invisible weights, smiling in her presence while silently battling demons she couldn't see. And though he tried to silence them, life has a cruel way of testing the very things we value most. Opportunity came knocking, and with it, temptation. Doors opening into worlds David had once dreamed of, filled with admiration, success, and people who made him feel like he was finally somebody. Sarah, selfless and supportive, urged him to chase those dreams, unaware that some of those dreams carried shadows with them. Shadows that would one day consume the light they had built together. It started small, a flattering word from someone new, attention that stroked his ego, opportunities that fed his hunger for validation. He brushed it off at first, convincing himself he could handle it, that Sarah would always remain his center. But love, even the purest kind, can be fragile when tested by pride and insecurity. And deep down, Though David adored Sarah, he carried a flaw he couldn't yet see, the belief that her love would always be enough to forgive anything. It was this flaw, this dangerous underestimation of love's limits, that would set the stage for his greatest downfall. Because what David didn't yet realize was that no matter how deeply a woman loves, even the strongest heart can break. And when it does, nothing in the world can piece it back together the same way again. Life with Sarah was unlike anything David had ever known. She was not just his lover. She was a sanctuary, his safe harbor when the storms of his past threatened to drag him under. In her presence, the restless shadows of his childhood seemed to quiet, as though her very existence was a balm to wounds no one else had dared to touch. When his mind spiraled into doubt, she was there with words of reassurance. When he staggered under the weight of his failures, she lifted him, not with judgment, but with unwavering faith. Slowly, David began to depend on her in ways he never admitted aloud. She became the filter through which he viewed his future, the steady rhythm to the chaos of his heartbeat. And no part of him feared this reliance, because to need someone meant to risk losing them. He couldn't resist leaning into her warmth. Sarah's love was relentless but tender, like a lighthouse guiding a lost sailor. Yet beneath his newfound sense of stability lurked the insecurities that had haunted him all his life. Every time Sarah sacrificed something for him, it pierced him with a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. She had walked away from a promising job offer. She had endured the criticism of friends who couldn't understand why she loved him, and she had given her time and her heart without hesitation. To David, these sacrifices felt too heavy, too undeserved. He began to wonder how long her patience could last, and what would happen if she ever realized that, despite her devotion, he was still the same broken man inside. It was this gnawing insecurity that began to open cracks in the fortress of love they had built. Cracks invisible at first, but destined to widen with time. It was during one of those moments of quiet fear that temptation found David. He had been offered an opportunity. Nothing monumental at first, just a chance to present his ideas to a group of influential people at a networking event. Sarah, ever supportive, encouraged him to go, her smile radiating pride as she adjusted his tie and kissed him before he left. David walked into that room carrying not just his ambition, but Sarah's faith in him like a shield. Yet as he stood among polished voices and admiring strangers, something dangerous stirred in him. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he could command attention, that he could be someone beyond the broken boy Sarah had rescued. Among the crowd was a woman, elegant, confident, with a gaze that lingered too long. Her words dripped with admiration, feeding the very insecurities David had tried to bury. She told him he had potential, that he deserved more, that he was destined for greatness. And though Sarah had whispered those truths countless times, coming from the stranger, they felt intoxicating, laced with the thrill of being seen in a new light. David brushed it off at first, reminding himself of Sarah waiting at home. But the seed had been planted. The validation he received that night ignited a hunger he didn't realize he carried. A hunger not just to be loved, but to be admired, envied, celebrated. Sarah's love had given him peace, but this new attention sparked something far more dangerous, pride. And pride, he would soon discover, was a kind of fire that could burn down even the strongest foundations. When David returned home that night, Sarah greeted him with open arms, eager to hear every detail. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her it went well, but he left out the glances, the compliments, the dangerous thrill of being desired by someone else. He convinced himself it meant nothing, that it was just a fleeting moment, but the memory of it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Sarah noticed something different in his eyes that evening, a flicker of distance, a shadow of distraction, but she dismissed it, telling herself he was simply tired. In her heart, she trusted him completely, perhaps too completely. Yet as days turned into weeks, David found himself chasing that feeling of validation again and again. He attended more events, sought out more opportunities, and each time the whispers of temptation grew louder. Sarah encouraged his success, unaware that the very world she was pushing him toward was slowly pulling him away from her. The suspense grew quietly, invisibly, like cracks spreading across glass. David still loved Sarah. There was no question about that. But love was beginning to battle against ego, and ego was winning. He told himself he would never betray her, that he could control the fire he had ignited. But fires, once lit, have a way of consuming everything in their path. And though Sarah continued to be his anchor, David was already drifting into dangerous waters, too blind to see how close he was to losing the very woman who had saved him. It began with small choices, the kind David convinced himself were harmless. A late-night conversation with a woman from the event, a lingering text message, a meeting that stretched longer than necessary. Each time, he reassured himself that it wasn't betrayal. Not really. Sarah still had his heart. This was just business, just networking, just harmless ego-stroking. But deep down, David knew he was treading dangerous ground. He felt in the guilt that flashed across his face when Sarah asked about his day, in the way his hand shook slightly when he deleted messages before she could see them. Yet he silenced the voice of conscience with lies. I deserve this, he told himself. After everything I've been through, after all the years of being nothing, I deserve to feel like somebody. And so the whispers of betrayal began, quiet but insistent, pulling him further from the woman who had given him everything. Meanwhile, Sarah noticed the changes. She noticed the late nights, the distracted gaze, the way his phone never seemed to leave his hand. But she trusted him, even when doubt gnawed at her heart. Trust was a cornerstone of their love, and Sarah clung to it desperately, afraid of what would mean if she admitted the truth, that the man she had fought for might be slipping away. David's world became a balancing act, a double life that grew heavier with each passing day. With Sarah, he played the part of the devoted partner, holding her hand, whispering words of love, tried to mask the guilt that shadowed his heart. With the other woman, he played the role of the man he thought he wanted to be, confident, admired, free of the chains of his past. The thrill of it was intoxicating, like a drug he couldn't put down. But the more he indulged, the more he realized he was losing himself. The lies piled up, one on top of the other, until he could barely keep track of them. And still, Sarah loved him. She cooked for him, prayed for him, supported him in every way she knew how. The irony of it was almost cruel. The more she gave, the more he strayed. Yet David told himself she would never leave, that her love was unbreakable, infinite, eternal. He believed she would forgive him anything, because hadn't she already forgiven his flaws, his mistakes, his brokenness? This belief became his shield, protecting him from the reality of what he was doing. But shields can shatter, and the cracks in their relationship were growing deeper, more visible, impossible to ignore. Suspicion is a slow poison, and it began to seep into Sarah's veins despite her desperate attempts to push it away. She noticed the subtle changes. The way David avoided eye contact when she asked certain questions, the way he grew defensive over nothing, the way his phone seemed to be guarded like a secret. At first, she told herself it was paranoia, that she was imagining things because of her own insecurities. But then came the inconsistencies, the meetings that didn't line up, the nights he claimed to be working late, but returned smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. Her heart ached with the weight of doubt, yet she clung to faith. She prayed harder, loved deeper, hoping that her devotion could pull him back from whatever edge he was dancing on. But love, no matter how strong, cannot erase betrayal. The whispers had grown louder now, echoing in her mind, in the silences between them, in the distance she felt when she lay beside him at night. Sarah wanted to believe, needed to believe, that David was still hers, that their love was still unshakable. But deep inside, a quiet dread was growing, a fear that the man she'd given everything to was slipping away into a world where she could not follow. Trust is the most fragile of things. Once cracked, it never fully returns to its original form. Sarah tried desperately to hold on to hers, but the cracks were spreading faster than she could mend them. Every time David came home late, her heart raced with unspoken questions. Every time his phone buzzed and he smiled faintly before tucking away, her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and pain. She wanted to ask, to demand the truth, but fear held her back. Fear of hearing what she already suspected. Fear of losing the man she loved more than life itself. David, on the other hand, was drowning in his own contradictions. He loved Sarah, of that he had no doubt. But he also craved the thrill of the other world he had stepped into. He told himself he could balance both, that he could have Sarah's unwavering love and the intoxicating validation of someone new. But balance was an illusion, and David's world was already tilting toward collapse. He could see the hurt in Sarah's eyes, hear the unspoken questions in her silence. And yet he couldn't stop himself. It was as if he was addicted, not just to the other woman, but to the danger itself. The thrill of walking the razor's edge, believing he could dance on it forever without falling. Sarah found herself caught in a war between love and self-respect. She had built her life around David, pouring into him when he had nothing, standing by him when the world turned its back, and believing in him when he didn't believe in himself. But now, that belief was being tested in ways she had never imagined. Every instinct told her to confront him, to demand answers, to force him to choose. Yet every time she looked at him, she saw not the betrayer she feared, but the broken boy she had fallen in love with, the man she had promised herself she would heal. She wondered if perhaps this was her test, if true love meant enduring even this. So she stayed silent, watching, waiting, praying. Her silence, however, only deepened the divide. David mistook it for ignorance, for blind trust that allowed him to continue his dangerous game unchecked. He didn't realize that silence can scream louder than words, that the absence of confrontation was not forgiveness but quiet devastation. Sarah carried her pain in secret, hiding her tears in the bathroom, whispering prayers into the night, while David slept beside her, oblivious to the storm raging in her soul. But no secret stays hidden forever. The cracks in their glass-like love had spread too far, and one more lie, one more careless mistake, would be enough to shatter everything. Sarah's suspicion had grown into certainty, though she hadn't yet confronted him. She had seen the way his eyes lit up at messages he never shared with her, the way his attention drifted even when she poured her heart out to him. She knew Deep down, that betrayal had already taken root. The only question left was when it would be revealed. David, blinded by arrogance and the belief that Sarah's love was unbreakable, failed to see how close he was to losing her. He didn't realize that the silence he took for patience was actually the calm before the storm, that every smile she forced was another thread snapping inside her. The tension between them was unbearable, like a fragile glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. And when it finally did, when truth came crashing down on them, it would not be with the explosive fury David feared, but with a quiet devastation that would wound far deeper. For sometimes, the most painful heartbreak is not in the screaming, but in the silence of a love that finally lets go. The truth, like a buried corpse, always finds a way to rise to the surface. For weeks, Sarah had been carrying the quiet torment of her suspicions, living in a haze of doubt and heartbreak. She tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that her insecurities were twisting reality. But deep down she knew that David was slipping further and further from her grasp. The moment of revelation came not with a bang, but with a whisper. One night, after David had fallen asleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, Sarah would have ignored it. She was not the type to pry, but something inside her, a force stronger than pride, urged her to look. With trembling hands, she reached for it, her heart hammering in her chest as if it already knew the devastation that awaited. And there it was, the message that confirmed her worst fears. Words dripping with intimacy, a conversation that had no place in their love. Proof that the man she had given her life to had given pieces of himself to someone else. For a long time, she sat there in the dark, staring at the glowing screen, her tears falling silently onto the bedsheets. It was as though the world had collapsed around her, yet the house remained standing, mocking her pain with its quiet walls. Sarah didn't scream, didn't wake him, didn't hurl accusations into the night. Instead, she felt a coldness settle into her bones, the kind of cold that comes when the fire of hope finally burns out. In that moment, she realized she had lost more than love. She had lost the faith she had built her world upon. Morning came heavy with silence. David awoke to the aroma of coffee, the routine comfort of Sarah's presence, and for a fleeting moment, he believed everything was normal. But when he entered the kitchen, he found her sitting at the table, her hands folded, her eyes red from a night of tears. "We need to talk," she whispered, and the weight of her voice pierced through him like a blade. David's heart began to pound as panic set in. He tried to smile, to brush it off, but Sarah slid the phone across the table. The incriminating messages opened for him to see. The color drained from his face as the reality of his betrayal lay bare between them. He stammered, searching for excuses, desperate lies to weave around the truth. But Sarah's gaze silenced him. It wasn't anger that filled her eyes. It was devastation, the kind that makes a person look older, wearier, as though love itself had been drained from their soul. "I gave you everything," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I believed in you when no one else did. And this is what you gave me in return." Her words shattered him more than any rage could have. He reached for her hand, begging for forgiveness, swearing it meant nothing, but Sarah pulled away, her silence screaming louder than his pleas. In that quiet kitchen, with the sun streaming through the window as though mocking their pain, David realized he had destroyed something far more valuable than he had ever understood. Sarah didn't pack her things in a frenzy, nor did she storm out in fury. Her departure was deliberate, quiet, and unbearably final. She moved to the house with the calmness of someone who had already cried every tear, who had already screamed every scream in the privacy of her own heart. David followed her from room to room, his words tumbling out in desperation, apologies, promises, pleas for another chance. But Sarah remained unmoved. She placed her belongings into a small suitcase, not bothering with the little things, because those no longer mattered. What mattered was her dignity, her soul, her heart that had been shattered into pieces too sharp to hold on to. At the door, she paused, her back to him, her hand trembling on the handle. "I loved you more than my own life," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But love is not meant to destroy me." And with that, she stepped out, leaving David standing alone in the silence of the home they had once shared. The echo of the closing door reverberated through him like a death knell. For the first time, he felt the true weight of his choices. Not the thrill, not the validation, not the fleeting satisfaction, but the crushing reality of loss. And though he told himself she would come back, that Sarah's love was too deep to ever walk away for good, a part of him, deep down, knew she was gone forever. In the weeks and months that followed Sarah's departure, David threw himself into work, into ambition, into anything that could silence the hollow ache in his chest. And on the surface, it worked. Opportunities multiplied, doors opened, and soon he was climbing higher than he had ever dreamed. He was invited to meetings with powerful people. His name began circulating in the right circles, and the applause grew louder with every achievement. To the world, David was a success story, proof that hard work and persistence could turn a nobody into somebody. But behind closed doors, in the quiet of empty hotel rooms and lavish apartments, Success felt like a cruel parody of happiness. The trophies, the money, the admiration, they filled his shelves but not his heart. The silence gnawed at him, reminding him that every victory was tainted by the absence of the one person who believed in him before the world ever did. He would stand before mirrors, dressed in expensive suits, surrounded by luxuries, yet see only a broken reflection staring back. Success had given him everything he once thought he wanted, but without Sarah, it all felt meaningless, like drinking from a cup of gold filled with ashes. David tried to drown the memory of Sarah in distractions. He surrounded himself with admirers, women who whispered sweet nothings into his ear, but none of them could replicate the warmth of her gaze, the sincerity of her love. Their words fell hollow, their touch empty, and each fleeting moment only reminded him of what he had lost. Nights became the hardest, when the world went quiet and his thoughts roared louder than ever. He would remember the way Sarah laughed, the way she prayed for him, the way she believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. These memories became both a comfort and a torment, haunting him like ghosts he couldn't exorcise. The woman he betrayed had once been his anchor, his compass, his light, and now he was adrift, lost in a sea of regret. He began to realize that his greatest punishment was not the absence of love, but the presence of regret that gnawed at him day after day, a reminder that some mistakes cannot be undone, no matter how deeply one repents. The more success David achieved, the emptier he felt. Crowds applauded him, but their voices only echoed the silence Sarah had left behind. Friends congratulated him, but their words felt like knives twisting in wounds that never healed. He bought a house larger than he had ever imagined, filled it with expensive furniture and decorations. Yet every room echoed with her absence. He would walk to the halls at night, hearing her laughter in the walls, seeing her reflection in the glass, until he could no longer bear it. Success had promised him fulfillment, but it delivered only emptiness. He realized, far too late, that Sarah had been the true measure of his wealth, the only treasure that had ever mattered. Without her, his victories were nothing but hollow shells, trophies for a man who betrayed his own heart. And though he tried to silence the ache with more accomplishments, more accolades, the truth remained. David had gained the world, but lost the one soul who had loved him beyond measure. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But for David, time only sharpened them. Everywhere he went, he saw Sarah. In the laughter of strangers, he heard echoes of her voice. In the kindness of others, he glimpsed her generosity. Even in silence, she was there, a ghost haunting every corner of his life. He replayed memories like broken records. The first time she smiled at him, the nights they stayed up talking until dawn, the sacrifices she made without complaint. These memories tormented him, not because they were painful, but because they were beautiful, and because he had destroyed them. He began to wonder what she was doing now. If she had found someone new, someone worthy of her love, the thought of another man holding her, cherishing her, cut deeper than any punishment life could offer. Yet he knew he had no right to jealousy, no claim to the heart he had shattered. Sarah was no longer his, and that truth gnawed at him like a relentless tide, wearing away his soul until all that remained was regret. Haunted by guilt and longing, David began searching for Sarah. He reached out to mutual friends, asked questions in whispers, hoping to find a trace of her life. But Sarah, it seemed, had vanished into a world beyond his reach. She had moved on quietly, leaving behind no breadcrumbs for him to follow. The more he searched, the more desperate he became, driven not by hope of reconciliation, but by a need to know if she was okay. He imagined her smiling again, perhaps even happy without him, and though the thought brought him pain, it also brought a strange comfort. At least, he told himself, if she was happy, then perhaps his betrayal hadn't destroyed her completely. Still, the not knowing tormented him. Every unanswered question became a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him with possibilities. He wrote letters he never sent, pouring out apologies, confessions, desperate pleas for forgiveness. But no matter how many words he wrote, they all echoed the same truth. He had lost her, and nothing he did could ever change that. The search led David not to Sarah, but to himself. Each unanswered question, each memory, forced him to confront the man he had become. He realized that his betrayal had not only cost him Sarah, it had cost him himself. The man Sarah believed in, the man she had loved, no longer existed. In his place stood a hollow shell, a man defined not by his triumphs but by his failures. And in the stillness of night, when sleep refused to come, he admitted to himself the most painful truth of all, that his punishment was not her absence, but the knowledge that it destroyed the only love that had ever truly mattered. Sarah had been his miracle, his salvation, his second chance at life, and he had thrown it all away for fleeting pleasure, for pride, for a validation that now meant nothing. That realization crushed him, leaving him broken in ways no one could see, condemned to a life haunted by memories of the woman he loved and betrayed. Sarah's absence from David's life was not an escape into oblivion, but a deliberate choice toward healing. She carried the wounds of betrayal like invisible scars, but unlike David, she refused to let them define her. For weeks, she moved through life in silence, processing the weight of all that had been lost. Nights were the hardest. Sleep often eluded her as memories replayed in her mind. David's laughter, his promises, his betrayal. But instead of allowing those memories to suffocate her, she began to face them. She prayed through her tears, wrote in journals until the pages blurred with ink and sorrow, and forced herself to confront the truth. She had loved deeply, but love had been misused against her. Slowly, she started to rebuild herself piece by piece. She joined a small community of women who, like her, had faced betrayal and heartbreak. Their stories mirrored hers, and through their strength, she found fragments of her own resilience. Sarah began pursuing things she had once set aside: her art, her writing, her dreams. She enrolled in classes, filled her days with purpose, and though the ache of David's betrayal still lingered, she refused to let it dictate the rest of her story. Each morning she looked in the mirror and repeated words of affirmation, not because she fully believed them yet, but because she knew one day she would. Healing was not instant, but with every step forward, she reclaimed a part of herself David's betrayal had tried to take away. In time, Sarah's world began to bloom again, like a garden that had been scorched by fire but now found new life in unexpected places. She found joy in simple things: walking barefoot on the grass, the smell of rain against the earth, the sound of her own laughter as she discovered she could still be happy. Slowly, she reconnected with people who truly cared for her, friends who had been waiting silently for her return. It was during one of these moments of quiet rediscovery that Sarah met Daniel, a man whose kindness was gentle, unassuming, and patient. Unlike David, he did not dazzle her with promises or overwhelm her with charm. Instead, he offered her something rare: consistency. Daniel listened without judgment, respected her boundaries, and never rushed her healing. At first, Sarah resisted the idea of opening her heart again, terrified of repeating the same cycle of pain. But Daniel never demanded her trust. He earned it, day by day, moment by moment. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt safe, seen, and valued not for what she could give, but for who she was. And though she was still healing, still mending the pieces of her heart, Sarah began to believe that love could exist without betrayal, that there could be a future brighter than the shadows of her past. Sarah's renewal was not about finding someone new, though Daniel was a gift she hadn't expected. It was about rediscovering herself. She realized that for too long, she had tied her identity to David, to his dreams, to his ambitions. She had sacrificed her own light so it could shine brighter, and in the end, he had cast her into darkness. But now, Sarah was her own light. She painted again, her canvases bursting with colors of pain and hope, each stroke a testimony of survival. She wrote poems that carried her tears, but also her strength, words that resonated with women who had walked through similar fire. People began to notice her work, to see her as more than the shadow of a broken relationship, and slowly she became a voice for healing. Sarah had been betrayed, yes, but she refused to remain broken. She was not a victim. She was a phoenix rising from ashes, stronger, wiser, and more radiant than before. And though David remained a ghost in her memory, she no longer wept for him. Her tears had turned into rivers of growth, her heartbreak into a foundation of resilience. For Sarah, betrayal had been the end of one chapter, but it had also been the beginning of a story she now wrote for herself. For David, time was no healer, it was a tormentor. Each day stretched into eternity, a reminder of what he had lost and could never regain. The success he once wore like a crown now felt like chains binding him to his guilt. He would sit in boardrooms surrounded by powerful men and women, yet feel like the loneliest man alive. At night, he wandered through his empty home, the silence pressing down on him until he thought it would crush him. He replayed Sarah's last words again and again: "I loved you more than my own life, but love is not meant to destroy me." That sentence haunted him like scripture carved into his conscience, unrelenting, unforgiving. He searched for her, yes, but when he found whispers of her new life, it only deepened the torment. Sarah was thriving without him, glowing with joy he had stolen, but she had reclaimed. The punishment was not in her absence, it was in her healing. She had risen while he had fallen. He realized now that true punishment was not wrath, not anger, not even rejection. It was watching the one you broke become whole again while you remained in pieces. David tried to fill the void with women, with alcohol, with distractions, but nothing dulled the ache that gnawed at him. He became restless, agitated, unable to escape his own thoughts. Every face reminded him of Sarah. Every touch felt like a mockery of what he once had and squandered. He stood before mirrors, staring into the eyes of a man he no longer recognized, a man who had traded eternal love for fleeting pleasure, who had mistaken validation for value. The loneliness was not just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, a hollow echo where once there had been warmth. He began to spiral, his work suffering, his reputation cracking, his inner torment spilling into every corner of his life. Colleagues whispered, friends distanced themselves, and soon the empire he had built began to crumble under the weight of his emptiness. Yet, for all his regret, for all his pain, David could not escape the truth. This was not a punishment dealt to him by Sarah or by life. It was a punishment he'd inflicted upon himself. Betrayal, he now understood, is a debt that collects interest, and the interest was his sanity, his peace, his very soul. In the end, David was left with the only companion he deserved, regret. He stood in the ruins of his choices, surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, but deprived of the one thing he truly needed. He heard news of Sarah occasionally, how she was painting again, how her work was touching lives, how she had found love in a man who treated her with the respect she had always deserved. And though his heart burned with jealousy, he knew this was right. Sarah had been meant for light, for happiness, for love that nurtures instead of destroys. And he had forfeited the right to be part of that story. Alone in his grand house, with the city lights stretching out like stars mocking his loneliness, David finally understood the full weight of his betrayal. He had not just lost Sarah. He had lost the man he could have been with her, the future they could have built, the legacy of love they could have shared. And as he poured himself a drink that night, staring into the abyss of his mistakes, he whispered into the silence, "She loved me and I betrayed her." Those words, heavy as chains, were the only truth left in his life, and they would be the last thing to haunt him until his final breath. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more.